In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Black Hammer build. This is a build using the Black Steel Greathammer. A lot of people have been asking me for a build for this weapon for a long time. Since I think launch of the DLC, I finally got into making a build for this weapon. So let's get into how this weapon works and what makes it so special. So the Black Steel Greathammer is a Greathammer weapon that has both physical and holy damage, and it has native strength, dexterity, and faith scaling. It's one of very few weapons in the game that has a secondary damage type that can still be infused with Ashes of War or weapon buffs, so it kind of is a bit unique in that regard. And another really interesting thing about this weapon is it has a unique block counter mechanic that sort of drags the weapon along the ground and flings out a holy trail of damage, not unlike the Black Knights that use this weapon. And the initial connection with the weapon does damage in ratio to the weapon. So if you deal mostly physical damage, you're set to maybe the heavy infusion, a little bit of holy, your weapon when it connects will do mostly physical and a little bit of holy. If you're set to sacred, it'll do more holy than physical. But the actual trail of holy magic or damage on the ground deals 100% holy damage. And what I have found is at the level that we're at now, if we go the sacred infusion, we actually get a little bit more damage on that trail than if we go the heavy infusion and then buff with something like Sacred Order. It's not a lot more, and I think as you go higher and higher levels, heavy will probably pay off more as you take your strength and faith higher and you're able to, buff with a higher Sacred Order buff over time. The one upside that we have to Sacred that I basically found is that you don't have to keep swapping to your seal and rebuffing your weapon. You can rebuff your weapon with Sacred Blade, which is the Ash of War that I'm using here, by just simply pressing L2. So it's really easy to rebuff your weapon this way. There's no swapping back and forth, and the damage is a little bit better than it would be with heavy at this point, but I think heavy will outperform it in the long run as long as you don't mind having to rebuff your weapon with your Sacred Seal. And one of the reasons I picked Sacred Blade here is not only for the extra damage we get when we're doing like block counters and such and with our regular attacks, is because we tend to lean in with this build to the defensive nature of it. We're using a shield. You could absolutely two-hand this weapon and block counter with it, but we get more guard boost off using a Great Shield, and we also have the hardness that a Great Shield provides, making block counters on regular enemies more easy. And I just feel like if you're going to use this weapon, you really should be block countering. It's really the unique feature of this weapon. And so I didn't want to, slot some Ash of War on here that just replaces the block counter, that you're just spamming all the time like you would in some build, and you're never seeing that block counter. I really wanted to use that block counter. So Sacred Blade gives us a way to buff our damage that further improves that block counter, and also gives us a ranged option for those times that we need a little bit of range. So we have a good melee setup with high damage, high stance damage, and we have a little bit of range when we need it. For Sacred Seal here, you can really use whatever you want. I think Clawmark Seal would be the best based off our stat spread, because you can actually use incantations rather effectively with the stat spread we have for this, but I wanted to showcase the weapon more than spells. But nevertheless, if you use the Clawmark Seal here, you can absolutely cast incantations. I'm using a Sacred Seal here that weighs nothing in order to keep my equip load medium, but you can absolutely use the other one, because I'm simply using Golden Vow here. I don't really care about what the incantation scaling is. I don't even meet the requirements for this Sacred Seal. I'm just using Golden Vow, but if you want to use the Clawmark Seal, you might have to take your endurance up a few points in order to stay medium rolling. So for my shield, I'm using the Black Steel Great Shield here, and I've set it to no skill in order to be able to use Sacred Blade with L2 when I need it. And this just kind of completes the cosplay, right? We're like kind of looking like a Black Knight. You can use whatever Great Shield you want. This one has 73 guard boost when fully upgraded, which isn't the best Great Shield out there, but I just love the look of it with this weapon. It would be hard for me to use a different one. Nonetheless, you could use other Great Shields if you want. So armor-wise, I'm using 2 pieces of the Armor of Knight set, the helmet and gloves, and 2 pieces of the Black Knight set, chest and legs, in order to kind of complete the look we're doing. When I started this build, I was using full Black Knight set, but what I found is that I would have to go even higher in endurance in order to be able to medium roll. So I changed a couple pieces, which gives us this look, which still looks really awesome. Still keeps us over 51 poise and allows me to not have to go higher with points of endurance or swap out a talisman in order to get more equip load. So there are a lot of good talismans for this build, and I just didn't want to use up one on equip load. Again, though, you can use any armor that you want. I would recommend getting one with over 51 poise, simply because you don't want to be interrupted during your block counter. So talismans I'm using for this build are the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for stamina recovery. You use a ton of stamina in this build because you're blocking a lot. block countering, and the weapon itself uses a lot of stamina to attack. So you really need to get your stamina back quickly, even though you have a ton of it. I also have the Curved Sword Talisman for further increased block counter damage. We are constantly doing block counters with this build, and we want to get the most damage possible. Shard of Alexander is also not bad. Sacred Blade does a decent amount of damage boosting that I find can usually one-shot enemies on the landscape. If you don't have it, sometimes you might deal like 90% of their health and not finish them off. We're not using Sacred Blade all the time, so this one isn't absolutely mandatory, but it's one that I'll use sometimes. You can obviously swap this out for other talismans, like Ritual Sword Talisman isn't bad. If you find you're not taking damage out on the landscape, further boost your damage, or maybe Axe Talisman for charged heavy attacks. Both of those are good choices, and there are a lot of other good choices as well. And for my last slot, I like to use Blade of Mercy. I do a lot of critical attacks in boss fights, like usually 2 or so, which is pretty good. And this will keep my damage boosted in between those stretches after doing a critical attack, which I really like. This doesn't happen on the landscape because you usually kill enemies with your block counter before you get a follow-up. So I like to switch this out for Crusade Insignia when I'm on the landscape, to just kill enemies outright and then get a damage boost. And again, the only spell I'm using here is Golden Vow to just give us more damage and more protection, since we have plenty of faith. But we have very high faith with this build at this point, and decent strength, so Clawmark Seal will allow you to slot other spells if you want. I just didn't really showcase them in this build. And of course, if you do decide to use other spells and kind of mix your strength and faith around just a little bit, you might want to consider swapping your talismans out for something that will boost spellcasting. And for stats for this build, at level 165, I have 55 Vigor, 27 Mind, 40 Endurance, 35 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 50 Faith, and 9 Arcane. 55 Vigor is simply there because you do trade damage sometimes when doing block counters. You'll see that in this video. You'll want to take this to 60 eventually, but you won't go higher than that. 27 Mind is enough to let you use Sacred Blade like as much as you need, which shouldn't be all the time, since you want to like use it, buff your weapon, let it expire, use it again, etc. theoretically. And it's enough to use Golden Vow and that, somewhat regularly. You might want to take this up to 30 eventually. Endurance is at 40 to give us tons of stamina and also equip load. We have a very heavy equip load with a great hammer and a great shield and a decently heavy armor composition. If you want to drop this lower, you could use an armor set that doesn't have 51 poise, maybe use a lighter great shield, but you'd be interrupted more often when doing block counters if you do that with armor. And, I don't know what the protection on your Great Shield might be if it's too much lighter than that. So there are options there, but if you want a medium roll, which I highly recommend, you don't roll a lot in this build, but you still will need to roll from time to time. I don't think heavy rolling is, something that I would expect like an average player to be good with. And then when it comes to strength, we have 35 here. This is to meet the requirements of the Great Shield, though you need at least 25 for the Great Hammer if you're one-handing it, which we are here. So you might be able to use a Great Shield that has like 30 strength requirement and drop this down a little bit. Because we're going with the Sacred Infusion, we really don't need any more strength than we need, even though you're still getting some damage out of it on the weapon, because it still remains with some strength scaling. You're going to want to focus on faith predominantly and just meet the requirements of the equipment that you're using for now. Dexterity is at 12. I can't get that lower on my Astrologer, so you only need 11, but you basically just to meet the requirements of the weapon. Intelligence is 16 again, just because I'm an Astrologer, but if you decide to go Sacred Order route, like if you do the heavy infusion and you're buffing with Sacred Order with a similar stat spread, you'll need at least 13 Intelligence anyway in order to use that spell. And then we have the rest of our points basically in Faith, 50 Faith. That's what I have left here after meeting all the requirements for everything and getting my equip load down, health at a good point, etc. Eventually you'll take Faith up higher, like to 80, in order to get more damage out of this build. And you do not need any Arcane for this build, unless maybe there are some incantations you want to cast if you're using the Clawmark Seal that have Arcane requirements. So for Flask of Wondrous Physique, I have the Holy Shroud and Cracked here to further boost holy damage. The vast majority of our damage is holy, not all of it. We still have some physical damage, like probably 33% or so. 30 of it is probably physical, but we're still getting a lot of benefit out of that, even at, 2/3 efficacy. So I definitely recommend that. And then I also have the Stone Barb Cracked here, which makes it easier to break stances. You definitely go for stance breaks a lot in this build, particularly very quickly in boss fights. So this is going to make it so our attacks, our block counters, everything we do does more stance damage, and this allows us to just get constant critical strikes on bosses and just really mess them up. It doesn't last as long as the Holy Shroud and Cracked here. I think it only lasts 30 seconds. So I tend to pop this inside the boss fight, or be very aggressive with my block counters trading early on in boss fights. Try and get a quick stance break to then trigger Blade of Mercy's damage boost. And if you're talking about great runes for this build, Radahn's is a great choice. Getting extra FP, stamina, and health all are good. Definitely recommend that. And Godric's is also not bad. You are using 6 or so of the stats. If you're using Sacred Order, if you went that route, you're going to be using 7 of the stats. So that could be a good way to go as well. So that wraps up my Black Hammer build. I want to do another build with the Black Steel Twin Blade. I'll probably do that at some point as well. Not sure exactly what I'm going to do with that. But I really, really love this weapon. A lot of people told me to make a build of this weapon, and I was kind of skeptical about it. But after using it, it's one of my favorite weapons. I think it's arguably in top 5 best weapons in the DLC. I don't know if you can quite put it in the top 5, but it's pretty close. And I should have a video pretty soon talking about what the top 5 weapons are, so stay tuned for that. As always, if you have comments about the build, if there are further tips, things I didn't mention that would help other players, please leave them in the comments. And if you have questions about it and don't quite understand something, leave that there as a comment as well, and I will try and get to it as soon as I can.